What if I told you that the rainforest is all in your head? Not literally, you don't have trees growing on your frontal lobe, and if you do, well, maybe get that looked at. No, what I'm saying is that ever since the not-so-good old days when Western explorers first started hacking their way in, we've had different ideas about what a rainforest is. It's in books, films, advertising, Disney, and there are two sides to the images this media presents. On the one hand, so pretty. On the other hand, so many ways to die horribly. But despite this deadly potential, it's more accessible today than it has ever been. Eco-rainforest feel-good retreats promise you a level of mental serenity you are simply not going to get lying face down in the beer-soaked grass of your local urban park. Infinity pools, treetop sleeping, and friendly wildlife are all just a lot of money and carbon emissions away. It's all rather lovely, really. Very photogenic. Yet, there has always been something darker underneath this. Because although we've tried to map it, although we know that some of the plants in there can heal us, and although there are probably at least 50 documentary teams running around in there at any one time, the jungle is still a mysterious and threatening entity. And it has always been like this. Because there's always been the heat, the parasites, that snake in your hammock swallowing your foot, or that cute little ocelot with its claws in your face. And in the 19th century, when they didn't have bug spray, sunscreen, or broad-spectrum antibiotics, it was so much worse. The rainforest was this beautiful, alluring place that drew people in, but that maybe wouldn't let them leave. And those people who did get out told some pretty wild stories. Your Victorian explorer type didn't just bring back biological specimens and scientific drawings, they brought back a concept of the rainforest. And it was this concept that made its way into the popular culture of the time, and now it's here in our popular culture. So, pack your snake be gone, and let's take a deep dive into those 19th century feelings of wonder and existential terror that have created our modern image of a rainforest. About this rainforest in your head, what does that actually mean? Western explorers first went trekking in the tropics in about the 15th or 16th centuries. Sometimes this ended well with navigational accomplishments and wonderful discoveries. Other times, things could go a bit wrong. Spanish soldier Francisco de Orellana was the first known European to fully navigate the length of the Amazon River. However, according to his wife, Francisco died of illness and grief in 1546 during the absolute catastrophe of his second expedition. And when I say catastrophe, well, what I mean by that is that Francisco started with 300 men and returned with about 46 who had endured shipwreck, starvation, hostile locals, disease, and having to eat their dogs and horses. So a good deal of misfortune, poor planning, and that classic Western overestimation of their own abilities. Poor Francisco, that jungle got you good. But still, people just couldn't leave well enough alone. You may be familiar with a little legend called El Dorado, the city of gold. The Spanish conquistadors certainly were. There was a trend for expeditions inspired by the idea that somewhere hiding in that jungly darkness was a lost golden city. Like many legends, it does have some tiny grain of truth. The Aztec and Incan civilizations did have a lot of gold, and there were tales of a ceremony held by the Muisca people of Colombia that involved covering a new king in flakes of gold and throwing a load of gold in a lake. So the idea of El Dorado stuck, and the Spanish Empire wanted gold, so El Dorado was what they set out to find. But let's be clear, it wasn't exactly as if they were lacking in gold at this point. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, the Spanish Empire had pillaged so much of it from the New World that they'd actually managed to crash their own economy via inflation. So chasing El Dorado was a mixture of greed and that bizarre human urge to find things that are hidden, especially if they're shiny. And all this adventure, whether it ended well or not, inevitably led to stories and information about the rainforest filtering back to Spain, Britain, France, the usual suspects. These stories didn't even have to be true or realistic. They could be the malaria-induced fever dream of some lost conquistador who barely made it home alive. But the point is, they set a precedent for how the rainforest was imagined back home. You've got horrible danger and death, like poor Francisco, but also the promise of something incredible, El Dorado. And so with these stories and tales, the rainforest became not only a physical place, but what has been called an imagined geography. It was somewhere that people didn't really know that much about. A space that was so completely different from the comparatively cold northern hemisphere, and a space that was full of exotic and unfamiliar and exciting plants and animals. But when you don't know that much about something, sometimes you begin to extrapolate and stereotypes begin to form. That's your imagined geography. You end up filling in the gaps and relying just a little bit too much on what tiny amount you do know. From the days of the conquistadors, the rainforests maintained their complex reputation. Half reality and scientific fact, half assumptions, imaginations, and exaggerated tales. And what makes this really interesting is that the terms rainforest and the tropics cover a wide cultural, geographical, and ecological spectrum. These forests exist in South and Central America, Western and Central Africa, Western India, Southeast Asia, the island of New Guinea, the Caribbean, and of course Australia. Thank you to the National Geographic for that list, and you can blame them if I have missed anywhere out. Yet, all of this diversity is lost in calling them the tropics and the rainforest. Because it didn't matter where it was. From Singapore to Sierra Leone, these terms became shorthand for extreme conditions. Western explorers faced the same problems in all of these places. The climate killed them, the wildlife ate them, and the locals had some understandably mixed responses to them. And so, the concept of a rainforest began to subsume all of these specific locations and began to embody particular Western assumptions. So, with all of this in mind, why did the West keep going back? One of the first things you cannot avoid noticing about the rainforest is just how much stuff there is in it. And one of the first major people to start documenting this stuff was Frederic Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt, a Prussian explorer who spent a lot of time poking around in South America and other places as well. Humboldt wasn't just a data collector though, he was a popularizer of the love of natural history, an early David Attenborough if you will. It was Humboldt who really pushed Western public interest in the rainforest to the next level, and what they saw was a lush, green, vibrant paradise filled with life. As Humboldt himself said, nature in these climates appears more active, more fruitful, we might even say more prodigal of life. And of course, Humboldt wasn't the only one fascinated by the amazing diversity that could be found in the tropical forests. Ornithologists, botanists, geologists, all the sciencey people, and artists were drawn to the rainforest as it became more open to travel and exploration. Collectors hauled specimens, dead and alive, back into Western hothouses, botanical gardens, and museums, not only to study them, but to try and capture the essence of the tropics and keep it on Western soil. Because at this point in the early 19th century, the rainforests were seen by many as an earthly paradise, a Garden of Eden full of food and potential. They were initially thought to be areas of great natural abundance, hot and humid with soil that seemed incredibly fertile, so everything in there could thrive. And the Western public went crazy for beautiful pictures and descriptions of these winterless lands and their amazing excess. A great example of this is the work of Frederic Edwin Church, an American landscape painter who traced Humboldt's route around South America and produced these grand sweeping vistas of the landscape showing all this lush vegetation and beautiful light. Church's work was extremely popular, showing an idealized nature that really captured the public imagination. So why was the Western world so enchanted with this Eden-esque forest? Well, one of the interesting things about the 19th century is that everyone was sort of facing a new modernity. Science, technology, general thought. Well, I mean, some of it at least, was in general progressing very rapidly, which was seemingly great, unless by an accident of birth you happen to find yourself in a slum slaving away in one of these newfangled factories producing goods to be shipped halfway across the world to a place you'd never see and to people you'd never meet. But this modernity was also scary. A fear of the future and even a fear of the present led to people idealizing images of the past. The rainforest reminded them of a simpler, more natural, less industrial age. And this was part of the imagined geography that was constructed for the tropics at this time. So this beautiful tropical paradise became an antidote to the rise of 19th century modernity. It reminded the rapidly progressing West and the mostly Christian Northern Hemisphere of the Eden that they thought they'd come from. This is the positive side to what is called tropicality. Tropicality is the more specific term for the imagined geography that the West constructed around the rainforests of South America, Africa, India, and everywhere else. Tropicality is the term used by scholars to label all the various attitudes towards the rainforest. It's the way Britain and North America and every other country with a 19th century superiority complex have seen tropical countries in an us and them binary. Church's art is an example of tropicality. It shows a specific image of the tropics from a Western perspective. But you may not be surprised to know that tropicality also has a negative side. And this comes from a bit of a contradiction. The West in the 19th century could idealize the natural and the primitive, but it also worshipped progress and control. And so the natural and the primitive could also symbolize a dangerous regression and a corrupting influence. All that amazing abundant overgrowth could begin to seem a little threatening if you looked at it for too long, and there might be a lesson in all those dead conquistadors. The jungle could resist your idea of modernity. And it was here that relationships with the rainforest began to turn sour. Because no matter what advertising might tell you, natural is not always better. What the West was beginning to learn was that showing up in an environment very different from your own that you didn't really understand, and thinking that you could somehow conquer it with your innate superiority, did not always end well. When you're lost in the middle of it and those fancy plants and animals start to fight dirty, the rainforest becomes something darker. You start to think that every one of those plants is out to get you, and they might be. Take the orchid. These are very trendy now, and they were very trendy in the 19th century. Thousands of exotic plants were imported into Britain in the 1700s and 1800s, but it was the orchid that really captured the popular imagination. Orchid mania was what collector James Bateman called it. And to find these tropical flowers, plant hunters had to go deep into the jungle. Rainforests in Singapore and the Amazon were considered especially good hunting grounds. On the artistic side, Martin Johnson Head, another American artist who was friends with Church, painted orchids side by side with hummingbirds against dark, overgrown and brooding tropical backgrounds. Head's orchids were delicate and painted accurately enough to be almost scientific. The flowers and the birds are the focus for the viewer, bright, jewel-like, enticing representations of tropical nature. But orchids were a strange and often dangerous obsession. In 1896, a newspaper article covered a group of plant hunters in Brazil who were told by a local chief about a village of demon flowers to the west. They were rare and wonderful, the chief said, but to approach them would be almost certain death. Now, of course, these brave flower finders had to go and see what all the fuss was about, so they set off into the jungle, and lo and behold, 3 of them ended up passing out due to a strange and sickening smell that suddenly filled the humid air. Although they tried, they could not actually get close enough to the mass of orchids to collect any, and had to retreat empty-handed after weeks of effort. The article ends by saying that somewhere in the depths of that vast tropical forest, they, the orchids, still remain to this day. The village of demon flowers had fought off the plant hunters. So a tropical orchid, plucked from the depths of the jungle by some mosquito-bitten adventurer, was this weird combination of beauty and death. They were considered so odd that H.G. Wells, the science fiction author, wrote a story called The Flowering of the Strange Orchid. In this, the flower literally tries to kill the man who bought it. His cousin finds him lying face upward at the foot of the strange orchid. The tentacle-like aerial rootlets no longer swayed freely in the air, but were crowded together, a tangle of grey ropes, and stretched tight with their ends closely applied to his chin and neck and hands. The immoral, killer tropical plant was seen as almost human-like with its murderous intentions, and this became a bit of a trope in the 19th century. It was almost a warning to Western imperialism. This is what happens when you try and take some of the jungle back to your own ordered, Western, civilized greenhouse. It will rebel. Meanwhile, some Westerners were in the actual jungle, and most of them were having an even worse time. In 1924, British explorer Percy Harrison Fawcett returned to the Brazilian jungle with his son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh. Percy had extensive experience of tropical forests, having undertaken 7 expeditions in South America from 1906, but this time he didn't come back. No one came back, and no remains have been found. And in some ways, Fawcett seems to have been eerily prepared for this. He left instructions saying that if his group were to go missing, no one was to come looking for them lest they suffer the same fate. In 1927, the Royal Geographical Society that Percy had worked for declared the men lost. So what happened? Did they die of disease, injuries, starvation, exhaustion? Piranhas, ocelot, snake, orchid? Did they drown? Were they killed by hostile locals? No one knows, and despite Percy's warning, and because humanity really isn't that smart, people have died trying to find out. But we do know what Percy was looking for: another lost city. By this time, El Dorado had been proven a myth, but the idea that the jungle still had something to hide was persistent. Percy was convinced that somewhere in the Xingu region in Brazil, he would find the remains of a lost city he called Zed, something to rival ancient Egypt. He had found what he thought were traces of Zed before, but obviously he wanted more. And to be fair to Percy, this wasn't entirely unreasonable. Decades before his quest, the remains of the mysterious Mayan civilization had been found deep in the Amazon. Covered in plants, hidden deep in the jungle and known only to the local population before Western explorers crashed the party, these remains seemed to be proof that if you just kept going, you would find something incredible. And this is what is so insidious about the jungle. This is what could really get in your head. The potential for more, the secrets that might be in there. And as we saw with El Dorado, this had already captured the Western imagination long before Percy's ill-fated expedition. But, as with most things, in the 19th century, it got worse. The West wanted to open up the rainforest, to farm it, to exploit its fertile soil, and to catalogue and control it. And that Western superiority complex didn't really do anyone any favours, because at the same time, the jungle was directly resisting Western attack. The more people moved into its interior, the more they encountered the vines, the trees, the humidity, and the disease that all became barriers to Western expansion. So, having started the century as an Edenic paradise, the rainforest was starting to look more and more dangerous. And in response to this, in popular culture and literature, the trope of the white man going mad among the trees started to appear. Joseph Conrad's first novel, Armea's Folly, from 1895, is filled with beautiful descriptions of the Borneo jungle based on Conrad's own time out there. But it also tells the story of Casper, a Dutch trader. Like so many, Casper has spent his career dreaming of the wealth and the gold he thinks might be hidden in the rainforest. He lives by the estuary of a jungle river, a dangerous waterway that rises with the rains but that also offers a tantalizing potential way further inland. For many years, the green and peaceful-looking islands guarding the entrances to the promised land kept their secret with all the merciless serenity of tropical nature. And the jungle's certainly as merciless to Casper as the story goes on. Its dark shade, so enticing in its deceptive appearance of coolness, so repellent with its unrelieved gloom, where lay, entombed and rotting, countless generations of trees, and where their successors stood as if mourning in dark green foliage, immense and helpless, awaiting their turn. Because, you see, for all its vivid life, the jungle is actually a place of death. All that tropical fertility is really a lie. By the end of the 19th century, they had figured out that the jungle actually feeds on itself. So underneath all that life, there is only decay and rot. Areas of the jungle that were cleared to use as farmlands did not yield the fertile soil that they wanted. Instead, everything failed. And this is what happens to poor Caspar. Another warning for Western imperialism. Ultimately, he never gets his gold. His daughter runs away, his wife defects to his enemy, and in despair, he burns down his house and later dies in an opium-induced haze. Oh, sorry, I should have said, spoiler alert. Another literary victim of the trees is Abel. Abel is the protagonist of W.H. Hudson's 1904 tropical romance novel Green Mansions. He enters the Venezuelan jungle to hide after a failed attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And to look for gold, of course, because even at this point we are not past that yet. But, having unsurprisingly failed to find wealth, Abel soon learns to appreciate the wonder and the glory of tropical nature, living in a local village. Later, Abel wanders into an even more pristine part of the jungle. And here Hudson encourages us to relive the Edenic idea of the rainforest. It is also here that Abel meets the love of his life, Rima. But, like poor Caspar, the jungle is Abel's downfall. Rima dies horribly, and Abel is left alone and haunted by memories in a jungle that is now unforgiving, harsh, and barren. He lives like a wild animal with no thought or feeling beyond its immediate wants. He builds a hut, lights a fire, and spends his nights essentially hallucinating with a voice in his head telling him, "Yes, you are evidently going mad. By and by you will rush howling through the forest only to drop down at last and die, and no person will ever find and bury your bones." His hair grows and tangles, his eyes become wild and strange, and his hallucinations creep into the daylight hours. Eventually, he can endure it no longer, and having found Rima's remains, he returns to civilization, a changed and broken man. At least he made it out alive. Back in the real world, Percy Harrison Fawcett was not so lucky, because, like many others in reality and fiction, Percy was lured in by potential, tempted by Eden, and seeking to take something from the rainforest. But the Western body and mind was not built to handle the tropics, and so the jungle was regarded with suspicion and fear as it handed out disease and death. It's almost as if the more that was known about the rainforest, the more terrifying it became. People tried to science it up, to clear it, to farm it, to understand it. But for a long time, that didn't really work. Until about the 1950s or so, tropical forests all around the southern hemisphere seemed to be almost sentient in their resistance. Tropicality was not one idea. It was not one stereotype. It's actually quite a complicated set of beliefs, assumptions, and almost vision-like concepts surrounding the tropical rainforest. And there were some fundamental elements of truth behind some of the beliefs in tropicality. The jungle was not a good place for most Western people to be in the 19th century and even into the 20th century. To be honest, I wouldn't want to go wandering around in there unsupervised today. That snake be gone will only do so much, you know. The ocelots are closing in, and I'm a little worried about how that orchid is looking at me. On the other hand, it is very beautiful out there. There is a reason that images of rainforests are used in marketing. To show a tropical forest is visual shorthand for Eden, a primeval paradise and an untouched nature. But of course, a lot of what's in there you shouldn't touch anyway. So part of its appeal will always be its darkness. The fear, the horror, the gory ways to die, the madness brought on by knowing that there must be something spectacular just around the corner. So it's not hard to see how and why the rainforest became this imagined geography for Western observers. You've got these amazing stories coming back, people not coming back, failed attempts at imperial control, killer plants, and still no El Dorado or City of Zed. And still no Percy either, but please stop looking for him, he does not approve. The orchid to its 19th century collectors was both beauty and death. And this tropical flower represents so well the duality in how the rainforest was seen at this time and how it is still seen today. Because ultimately, to see the rainforest as Eden-like is to create an imagined geography. And Hudson and comrades' visions of a jungle that would eventually destroy you is also in part an imagined geography. This duality of tropicality, and that's a nice convenient rhyme there for you to remember that by, is still with us now. This is a contradiction that started with the conquistadors and that came of age in the 19th century. You could hold the rainforest up as a wonderful, spectacular place that reminds you of man's first footsteps on this earth at a time when the world was full of smoke and fire and industry. You could also see the jungle as something diseased, something dangerous and primitive that would take your humanity and spit you out as a skeleton.